something about this story does not quite make sense. In the spring of 1848, in a small wooden farmhouse in a village almost no one had heard of, two young girls began communicating with the dead, or so the world came to believe. Within months, their story had spread across the eastern United States. Within years, it had crossed the Atlantic. Hundreds of thousands of people, lawyers, senators, scientists, and clergymen, accepted what these two sisters claimed as evidence of life beyond death. Seance parlors multiplied in drawing rooms from New York to London. A new religious movement, eventually counting tens of millions of followers, was born from the sounds that came from the walls of that house. And yet, 4 decades later, one of the sisters stood on a stage before a crowd of 2,000 people and confessed that she had made the whole thing up. The confession was reported. It was printed in the newspapers. And then, somehow, it was almost entirely forgotten. To understand what happened in Hydesville, New York, in 1848, you must first understand what kind of world existed before it. America, in the mid-19th century, was a nation consumed by death and desperate for meaning. The average life expectancy hovered around 40 years. Cholera epidemics swept through cities. Infant mortality was so common that many families expected to bury at least one child before that child could walk. Death was not a distant abstraction. It was a presence in every household, announced at every church bell, inscribed on gravestones that crowded the edges of every small town. At the same time, something else was stirring. The Burned-Over District, a stretch of western New York so named because it had been swept repeatedly by religious revivals, was producing new movements, new prophets, and new faiths at a rate unlike anywhere else in the Western world. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had been founded there just 18 years earlier. The Millerites, who predicted the imminent return of Christ, had gathered their followers and waited for the end of days just 4 years before the events in Hydesville. This was a landscape hungry for signs, for proof, for something that could bridge the distance between the living and the dead. Into this world stepped the Fox family and 2 daughters who would change everything. The Fox family moved into a modest frame house in Hydesville, New York, in December of 1847. There were the parents, John and Margaret Fox, and their 2 youngest daughters, Margaretta, who went by Maggie, 14 years old, and Catherine, known as Kate, who was 11. Almost immediately, the family reported hearing strange sounds at night, knocking and rapping noises that seemed to come from inside the walls and floors. No source could be found. No explanation was offered. On the evening of March 31st, 1848, something changed. Kate, the younger of the 2 girls, reportedly addressed the invisible source of the sounds directly. She snapped her fingers and called out to it. She asked it to repeat the sounds she made, and the sounds responded. Knock for knock. The family established a crude alphabet system, a certain number of knocks for each letter, and through this method, they reportedly communicated with what they believed to be the spirit of a murdered peddler named Charles B. Rosner, whose body, they were told, had been buried beneath the house. Neighbors were summoned. Crowds gathered. The story moved quickly through the region, passed from one mouth to the next. By April, investigators had arrived. By summer, Maggie and Kate had been brought to Rochester, where their older sister Leah Fish took charge of their presentation to the public. What had begun as a local curiosity was becoming something else entirely. The Fox sisters did not simply tell stories. They performed. In darkened rooms, before paying audiences, inexplicable sounds answered questions posed to the spirits. Tables lifted. Hands materialized in the shadows. The knockings continued, always following the sisters from city to city, from parlor to parlor, as though the dead traveled with them. What the official account rarely mentions is how quickly the apparatus around the Fox sisters grew into something financial and organized. Leah Fox, the elder sister, had struggled for years as a music teacher in Rochester. She was practical, experienced, and ambitious. Within months of taking the girls under her management, she had established a structured business. Sittings were held at set hours. Audiences paid for the privilege of contact with the spirit world. In 1850, the sisters were brought to New York City and introduced to the public at Barnum's Hotel, where their sessions drew newspapers and prominent citizens alike. Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune and one of the most influential journalists in America, attended and wrote of the experience with measured fascination. Newspaper archives from this period tell a complicated story. The New York Tribune, the Rochester Democrat, and the Buffalo Commercial Advertiser all covered the Fox sisters extensively. Some accounts were reverential, others were skeptical. As early as 1851, professors from the University of Buffalo published a report suggesting that the sounds were being produced by the girls themselves, specifically by the cracking of their knee and toe joints, manipulated in ways that were difficult to detect. This finding was not ignored. It was published, it was discussed, and it was overwhelmed. Because by 1851, the movement the Fox sisters had helped create was no longer something that could be stopped by a scientific report. Spiritualism had become a social phenomenon, a faith, a political identity. Many of its adherents were connected to the abolitionist movement. Others were early suffragists. The seance table had become a place where women could speak with authority, channel voices, command silence in rooms otherwise closed to them. Spiritualism offered women something the formal religious institutions of the era largely denied them: a platform. What begins to emerge when you look across the archives from this period is a pattern that few historians have fully addressed. The Fox sisters did not operate in isolation. They were surrounded by a network of promoters, true believers, and in some cases, individuals who had significant financial and ideological reasons to keep the phenomenon alive and growing. Leah Fox in particular cultivated relationships with wealthy patrons who funded the sisters' activities for years. Some of these patrons had invested not only money, but identity into the movement. To accept that the knockings were a trick would have required them to accept that they had been deceived, and that, for many, was simply not possible. By the 1850s, there were an estimated 1 million self-identified spiritualists in the United States. By 1870, some estimates place the number as high as 8 million. There were spiritualist newspapers, conventions, communities, and churches. The world that the Fox sisters had helped create had grown far beyond their ability to control it, and in some sense, far beyond their ability to escape it. There are documents that do not appear in most popular retellings of this story. In 1857, a publication called The Boston Courier sponsored a scientific investigation of several prominent spirit mediums, including individuals trained in the tradition the Fox sisters had established. The committee, composed of Harvard professors and scientists, concluded that no evidence of genuine spirit communication had been found, and that the phenomena observed could be explained by natural causes. This report was published. It was largely ignored by the spiritualist press. There is also the matter of a letter written by a neighbor, Mrs. Mary Redfield, who was present on the evening of March 31st, 1848, and who described the night's events in a document preserved in regional archives. Her account is notably less dramatic than the version that later circulated in pamphlets and newspapers. She remembered confusion, not certainty. She remembered children who seemed, at moments, to be suppressing laughter. Then, there are the private letters of Maggie Fox herself, some of which were published years later, and some of which remain in archives rarely consulted. In these letters, written during her years of public performance, Maggie describes exhaustion, fear, and a growing sense of entrapment. She describes the pressure placed upon her by Leah. She describes a life in which she had lost the ability to separate the performance from herself. In 1888, Margaret Fox Kane, Maggie, now in her mid-50s, stood before an audience at the New York Academy of Music and made her confession. She had been paid by a newspaper, reportedly around $1,500, to make a public statement. She demonstrated, on stage, how she and her sister had produced the mysterious knockings by cracking the joints of their toes and feet. She was explicit. She was specific. She claimed that Kate agreed with her account. The confession was covered in the press. The New York World ran the story. Other papers followed. But within a year, Maggie had recanted. She withdrew her confession and claimed it had been made under financial pressure and personal distress. Kate, who was struggling with severe alcoholism by this time, gave contradictory accounts. Both sisters were by then impoverished, ill, and largely abandoned by the movement they had helped build. Maggie Fox died in 1893. Kate died the same year, several months earlier. Neither left behind a final, definitive statement. What remains unresolved is not whether the sisters produced the sounds themselves. The evidence for that conclusion is substantial, and was accepted by most serious investigators even in their own lifetime. What remains unresolved is the larger question. Who knew? And when did they know it? The wealthy patrons, the editors, the scientists who observed the phenomena up close. How many of them suspected or knew and chose silence because the alternative was too disruptive? Because the movement the Fox sisters had created was providing something that people genuinely needed, genuinely believed in, genuinely found comfort within. There is also the matter of the house. Decades after the Fox family left Hydesville, excavations were reportedly made in the basement. In 1904, a wall collapsed and workers found, buried beneath the foundations, a collection of bones. Local newspapers reported the discovery. Some said the bones belonged to a human being. The story circulated briefly, then faded. Whether those bones were ever formally examined, and by whom, and what conclusions were reached, is a question for which no entirely satisfying answer has yet surfaced in the public record. Perhaps it was nothing more than two imaginative girls who discovered, one March evening in 1848, that they could frighten the adults around them with a simple trick, and then found, to their growing alarm, that they could not take it back. Perhaps Leah Fox was simply an opportunist, a woman who saw what her sisters had stumbled upon and understood its commercial value, as any shrewd person in her position might have done. Perhaps the millions who followed the movement were simply grieving people who found comfort in the belief that the ones they had lost were still, somehow, reachable. All of this may be true. Most of it probably is. And yet the archives still hold things we have not fully read. The letters sit in boxes, the newspapers yellow in their folders. The bones beneath the Hydesville house, if they were ever properly catalogued, have left no clear trail. What we know is that two girls knocked on the floors of a farmhouse, and the world listened. We know that they confessed, and then recanted, and then died. We know that the movement they helped create outlasted them by generations, and in some corners of the world continues still. What we do not fully know is the shape of the silence around them, who stood close to the Fox sisters and understood exactly what they were seeing and chose, for reasons of faith or profit or comfort or power, to say nothing at all. Maybe the story ended in that theater in 1888 when Maggie cracked her toes and the audience gasped. Or maybe the most important part of the story never made it into the newspapers. Maybe it never will.